Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Econ Playground. Today we've got with ourselves Molly Harnish, who I've known for 3 years. 3 years. We're both George Mason undergrads. Oh no, I'm not. I graduated.
You graduated, Marcus.
We met as George Mason undergrads, both economics students, and we're here. And we're here to talk about Molly's project that she's been working on for a while now. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Okay. Well, first, I'd like to say we've known each other for 3 years, but we've known each other by like 1 degree of separation for like our entire lives.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. We're both from the Delaware County, Pennsylvania area.
Yeah.
This is a pretty good area.
It is a pretty good area.
I met another one that might be a connection, but we'll continue.
We'll talk about that later.
Continue. Yeah.
Marcus and I know all the same people. It's kind of wild that we only met in college. But yeah, so I can talk about the project. I've been told that apparently when I am on podcasts, which I've done this like once before, but I give like very short answers. So just ask me another question if I don't answer it for long enough, I guess.
Yeah.
But basically, I'm doing this project. It's my undergraduate thesis for Mason. And it's an environmental economics question. So I'm looking at how a change in land ownership, specifically in forest ownership, affected conservation. And part of what I'm working on right now is really figuring out how to operationalize conservation. But basically the idea is Florida passed this law in 1990, and it was the Florida Preservation 2000 Act. And it basically funded public land acquisition to the tune of $3 billion. So $300 million a year over 10 years. Which was unprecedented both in the state and like at the national level. I'm remembering that Florida's funding, like public funding for public land acquisition, made up 1/3 of all state governments funding for public land acquisition, like during that time period. So it was a big
from 1990 to 2000. That is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the paper that I read that in was like 92 2001 or something. But yeah, that same time period. So. And it actually says in the act, it calls it an aggressive program of public land acquisition, like the word aggressive is in there.
Yeah.
So it's very clearly like it's an interesting policy and program to study if you're looking at, okay, if the government owns more land, what does that do for conservation? The forest health thing is another thing, which I can get into more, but it's not even that forests were the point of the act or anything. There is some funding set aside specifically for the Division of Forestry, but that's just kind of something I've been interested in for a while, and we can talk about that more later, I guess, in the podcast. But so my question is, what's the relationship between this change in timberland ownership? So Florida's, well, let me back up a little bit. It's weird to like talk about it. I don't even know. I live in it. I can't see the forest for this.
I know exactly what you mean. Oh, wow. yeah, exactly.
Very, very punny. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I guess that's the difficulty with all research is like backing up and explaining it.
Yeah.
But so not only did Florida pass this act, but this proportion of timberland that was owned by the state and the actual amount of acres drastically increased for Florida relative to the rest of the southeastern states. So I'm using the Southeast as defined by the Forest Service, which is Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia.
Okay.
Yeah. So it like skyrocketed compared to the other states. So you can say, okay, they passed this act, they got this funding through, it did something in terms of land ownership. So what was the effect of it? Did it actually work for conservation? So that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out. And the official research question, right, is what was the relationship between this change in land ownership, forest health, and the forest products industry in Florida? So,
okay, well, then I've got a question first that I haven't got the question now, but it's got a seed in it, a secret seed that may end up in the later conservation or later part of the conversation is a conservation conversation. Okay.
The amount of times I've spelled that word wrong, like when I mean the other word, is just unreal at this point. But
okay, so give us a little bit more on why the act was passed. Whose idea was it? What was the goal of it? It's an aggressive land ownership program, but maybe they're just using it to have a big playground or something. Why would they be buying so much land, and why specifically in Florida?
So part of the impetus for the act was that people were moving to Florida really fast. Like Florida's population was growing at a rate that was much faster than that of the US as a whole. And so, and it was a bipartisan effort. Like Florida had been passing acts to control, like, not control population growth, that's not what I mean, but like to stop development from taking over like these kind of wilder areas. for a while, but this was kind of like obviously a big jump in that. But that was a big impetus, was population growth in the state and concern that development to accommodate those new people would overrun natural areas. So, and it was like I said, a pretty bipartisan effort. It wasn't like a contentious bill. I'm pretty sure. Oh, I'm not going to quote any numbers because I'm going to misquote them. But there was an amendment to make it possible to keep that funding going in perpetuity rather than like needing to renew it every 10 years or whatever. And it passed, I want to say, like, it was an overwhelming majority. It as a ballot initiative kind of thing. So
interesting. Oh, like from the voters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh wow, interesting.
Yeah, they had to amend the Florida Constitution to get it to happen. Yeah. So and it was like
constitutions are always wild.
Yeah, I know.
I'll just tell you, read all the amendments to the Texas Constitution. Those things are wild. And speaking of state constitutions too, you know that Vincent Ostrom from the famous Ostroms,
of course,
was he was one of the people that they got to help write the Alaska Constitution. So,
really?
Yeah. So if you're interested in this stuff, talk to Bobby Hertzberger, Paul Aljica about it, and they have a section in their constitution, like an article in their constitution about natural resource use.
Really?
Yeah, it's definitely worth checking out if you're interested in state conservation policies.
Yeah, no, I mean, I should, because that's another, not to go down a total rabbit trail, but just the differences between the East and the West are really interesting because conservation, I mean, not that it wasn't a concern, but like it was easier to, there's a lot more public land in the West because it wasn't owned by like,
yeah,
like it was owned by the Native Americans.
7%.
Right. Yeah. So it's very interesting to see the kind of institutional differences in that. But another idea for other research later.
Exactly. But now, Florida, if you think about it, is like, if you think about Florida's natural resources, what it's like compared to like the rest of America, or at least I'm thinking like the Northeast where we're from, where we are from, it's like a jungle. Like Florida's like a different planet almost, you know? You just talk about like, oh yeah, there's alligators in, is it alligators? Yeah, alligators. Crocodiles are the ones in Egypt. Yeah. It's alligators, and I'm like, oh yeah, there's alligators like in Florida, and there's all this like crazy stuff in Florida, and you just forget about that sometimes. So, and I'd imagine that there's a lot of really interesting, unique wildlife and such down there. Such that is the federal government involved at all here? Is the Endangered Species Act invoked? I
mean, yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of different layers of government that are getting involved. And that is part of why forests are, and why a lot of the land they were conserving is important as wildlife habitats. So yeah, I would venture a guess that the ESA is definitely in force here. But that's kind of what's interesting about it too, is like, in terms of land ownership, it wasn't like, it's not like public land ownership went up in Florida, but it's totally driven by like state and local, like the national forests and the like land owned by like the Bureau of Land Management and stuff stayed pretty much the same. Like there wasn't a huge change in that. It was just completely state driven.
That's interesting. That's interesting. That and I suppose if there's a lot of these out of state people moving in, as you're saying, and that's what drove part of the push to get this done, are these new Floridians, are they the voters that are voting for this bill at the same time?
Right. That's interesting. And I don't know, I did a literature review kind of over the summer, like not like more for myself just to have background on it. Yeah. Partly on the coalitions that supported environmental like bills. And it's pretty much what you would see in the broader United States, that voters who tend to be more liberal, more democratic, so those same demographic groups are going to vote, which isn't surprising, right? Because the environmental causes tend to be more of a democratic, issue. But I would have to look and see who new Floridians were and how well that lines up. But that's an interesting question.
Yeah. So the goal of the bill was to conserve the forests, right? And as we all know, whatever the goal of the bill is, that's pretty much what happens. Forests were conserved, and then the story's over, right?
Yes.
And then the research is done.
The research is done. We're done. Yeah, no, so that's kind of exactly what I'm getting at. Is like, okay, did this bill do what it said it was going to? And why that's especially interesting is because one of the reasons it's interesting is because Congress just passed earlier this year the Great American Outdoors Act, which is very similar to this bill, but on the national level. So the National Park Service finally got funding to like fix the potholes in the roads. And it allocates, I want to say it's, I'm not going to say any numbers, but it's billions of dollars. It's billions of dollars for land acquisition. So it's a similar bill, has a lot of similarities. So it's interesting to see, okay, what happened in Florida, and is there not proof, but is there evidence that it might work at a larger scale?
Right.
So.
Well, but before we move on too much, let's just show the folks at home some of these sick graphs that you've built.
All right, let's do it.
We've got, boom, this guy. Whoa.
Yes.
There's this guy. This is what you're talking about, pre-1991, and that's before the Florida bill, I suppose. So it looks like all the states are buying some, they're increasing the land that they have, right? But Florida by a factor of umpteen here.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and that's about double, it looks, from 2,500 to about 5,000. And everyone else is just creeping up. And we're comparing it with the other states in the area, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the analytical framework. It'll be a difference in difference, or not but the method is going to be
right. The econometric method.
Yes.
Yeah. And then the other guy that we got here is specifically for timberland.
Yes. Yeah. So this is actually all timberland, but yeah. So that other graph, if you go back for a minute, can you?
Oh yes, can do.
Now I really feel like I'm giving a presentation. Can you go back to the other slide? Yeah. So this just zeroes in on the reason it's pre-1991 and post-2005 is because different states took different forest inventories at different years, because of course, why wouldn't they, to make my life easier? And so that's why, so this is just zeroed in on that time period. And then the graph, the next one, your cue.
It's this one there.
Yes. This one shows, so 1953 to 2017 is the number of years that the Forest Service has this data for. So it's not like all the points there are years, like there aren't data for every single year.
Yeah.
But this kind of zooms out and shows the entire trend. So you can see, I mean, Florida's above all of the other states.
Florida's always been
from the beginning, right? But it just takes off.
In love with land, yeah. Yeah,
and that's 97 is kind of that like almost inflection point kind of thing.
This point right here.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of the motivation behind the project, is like, okay, they passed this bill, it did something. You know.
Yeah, I believe you that it worked.
Cool. Good.
There's a little bit of a dip here. Do you know anything about that?
I do not. Part of it is they started collecting data every 5 years instead of every 10. So that's 2012 and 2017. I don't know if that's like just reflecting state budgets after the recession. I don't know.
Maybe they sold a little bit. Yeah, that's possible.
Yeah.
That's possible.
Yep.
Okay, so this is what happened, and then their goal is to conserve the forest land, but this is what you were telling me earlier, is a little bit tough to figure out how to actually measure something like that. And this is the nuts and bolts of figuring this stuff out. So tell us your journey of how you've tried to explain this thing over time.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So I started out and I proposed this project in its current form and recognizable as what it is now. And I wanted to measure forest land or timberland use, there we go, by the timber products industry. So I wanted to look at specific NAICS sectors and define, like say, okay, look at wages, employment, and establishments in those sectors and subsectors and industries, and see what happened. And I've, with help from my mentor, kind of realized that those things are interesting and there's still things that I would like to include in my final project, but that doesn't tell the whole story of did the bill work? Did the policy work? So right now what I'm doing is I'm looking, first of all, at output. So still an economic variable of like, okay, what was the output of the forest products industry, which includes paper products, wood products, and like what you would think of as logging and forestry. and looking at that total output and seeing if that changed, because that you can kind of see how that would connect more to conservation as kind of the flip side of conservation, right? If you're not conserving resources, you're using them, to put it very simplistically.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at that, but I'm also looking at more just conservation variables, so stuff collected by the Forest Service, and yeah, even like trying to look into air quality, water quality, other measures of general environmental quality, which has been really interesting for me because I'm like not an ecologist. I'm learning a lot, and I've been actually trying to take classes throughout college to get different viewpoints on environmental policy and environmental indicators and stuff. So I have been doing the best I can to understand it, but it has definitely been interesting to kind of figure out how to measure this thing, and that's what I'm in the middle of doing right now. So.
But before you even have the measurement, just applying the the economic way of thinking, what do you hypothesize to find, or the intuitive just reason that they would do something like this is, oh, if we put the land in the hands of people who specifically care about it, then they're going to conserve it over a long period of time. Hey, if we're cutting into people's profits, that's fine. And so they don't mind the trade-off there, right? But what do you see as potential unintended consequences of a policy like that, other than just we're cutting into these people's profits?
Right. Well, and see, that's the thing that I'm not so sure is going to happen. And from preliminary looks at some data, it doesn't really seem like there was any effect economically, and as far as statistically difference in difference kind of thing. And part of that, I think, is that a lot of these, first of all, a lot of private owners of timberland are these really large, especially in Florida and in Georgia, are investment corporations. So it's not like your average Joe owns a forest down the street or whatever, right? Like it's these huge corporations. And so they are going to manage it differently. And that's another thing, just look into family forest owners. Anyway, my hypothesis is that these private owners had some land sitting that had trees on it that they weren't necessarily really using productively. And so when effectively it created, and this is something that I've talked to, I can't take credit for this phrase, people in Florida and at PERC also about this, that this bill almost created a market for conservation where these timberland owners said, oh, someone wants to buy this land with trees on it that I don't really want anyway. Great. Here you go. And it might have taken some land away. That land might otherwise have been used for development. So that might be another thing to look into, is okay, what happened in real estate, right? And construction. Yeah, that maybe they didn't have that land anymore. But I wouldn't expect to see, and I haven't so far seen that much of a change in the timber industry. Just because the land changing hands, it's not like they're going to sell their prized couple acres or whatever, right? They're first going to sell the land that's not really that productive anyway.
Right.
So it's also interesting to look into conservation organizations and the role that they played, because they could have been a middleman between these corporations or these private owners or whoever and the state, right? So the owner could sell it immediately to a conservation agency who specializes, right, in dealing with conservation and can take care of the land, right? And they'll also be better able to deal with the state and have more experience working with them in that sort of land deal. So interesting to look into that as well.
This still wasn't anything like an eminent domain thing. It's just the government saying, we're just going to pay, and presumably above market rate, right?
Yeah, I don't actually know what the pricing, and that's something I have to look into more. But yeah, I did look into, because I was like, okay, is this just an eminent domain thing? But they say specifically in the bill, they're we don't want to do that unless absolutely necessary. So there's a specific procedure, if there's land that is marked as being desirable for whatever reason for conservation, I think they have to approach the owner multiple times, and then only if they get no response and a couple other boxes get checked, then that's only when they can pursue that sort of road.
Yeah.
So it's generally supposed to be a willingness to sell kind of thing.
Because the idea behind something like this is, if that land, if the owner knows the true value of their land, and they know that it can be used for timber, they know that it can be used for development, then they would be charging the government higher and higher rates. So there might be a problem just in the sense that the government would be paying higher because the government doesn't have an incentive to to pay at the market rate. They'd just be paying at these higher levels just to get as much land as fast as possible, because the person in charge of buying the land, it's probably just their job to just buy up land. It's not their job to make sure that you don't spend too much money buying land.
Well, but actually, they have like a whole committee set aside, and they had to do appraisals of the land and everything. And if two appraisals didn't match up, they had to go and do a third one. So there was definitely some intentionality in the evaluation of the value of the land. So yeah, it's a whole project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Now, okay, this is the thing that I was trying to plant earlier that I'm interested in, especially, and it got even more interesting after you talked about the ballot initiative, right?
Yeah.
Where some of the data that you showed me, can I put up that wages data?
Yeah, and I can explain how it's like basically means nothing.
It's a little bit old. It's a little bit older, but
it's a little older. Yeah.
I was very interested in it.
Yes, it's factually correct. It's just kind of doesn't really tell you the story.
Okay.
I'm interested in telling.
But you'd say that generally what you learned was that the wages increased over time after the bill was passed, and average annual pay is going up, total annual wages are going up. But at the same time, this is employment in the industry, in the timber industry, and this is like timber companies or timber establishments. What is an establishment?
However, the NAICS defines it. This is for you can see the forestry and logging subsector. So I'm not really sure.
Okay. So, okay, I see what you mean.
This could be a smaller farm or whoever registers with as an establishment.
But so my first intuition when I looked at this was to think, okay, this is the price of labor, and this is like the quantity purchased, especially this one is the quantity purchased. So in which situation, think back to supply and demand, in which situation does the price go up and the quantity go down is when there's a negative supply shock, right?
Yeah.
So the question here is, if you look at this graph and you say, if you're a timber worker, this is a good thing for you because your wages go up, right?
Right.
Is that the case? Or is something like, all the low wage earners were cut out somehow, right? And the first thing I saw, I don't have any facts on the table, but the first thing I saw was unions getting involved and cutting out low-skilled workers or something like that.
That's interesting. See, this is the thing with this graph is this is just Florida, and it's really hard to tell. So you could tell a story like that, right? Like you could, one interesting question would be, okay, why did wages rise and why did employment go down and all of this, right? Another thing to think about too is this goes until 2017. So you've got 2007 in there. And what do you use to build houses?
Yeah, the same, or wood.
Wood, right? This industry really suffered after that. So, so that's something to think about with this. But so anyway, you could that would be a really interesting question. But as far as the question I'm trying to answer is, did this bill have an effect? And to do that, you have to see, or this law, right, have an effect. So to do that, you have to compare it to the rest of the states in the Southeast. And so if all of their wages went up in around the same amount or around the same trend, it's still an interesting question of why, but it doesn't seem like this policy had anything to do with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you need a lot of data from before and in other areas. You need cross-sectional data. Yeah. Okay, very, very interesting. Yeah, and so one of the big lessons that we're learning and that you learned doing this, I'm sure too, and that everyone in the world needs to learn, is that just looking at a graph is not going to tell you very much.
Yes.
And especially every graph needs a ton of context.
Yes.
And you'd be surprised. People throw claims like all the time. People just say like, "Oh, this happened. I saw this," or "This happened," because they'll share something online, or they'll just see one graph for like 5 numbers or something. Literally no one checks the numbers. Yeah. Almost every time, if you check the numbers, you go, "Oh, that's different than what they said." Almost every time, I guarantee you, it's like it should be. People should make this their hobby, double checking the numbers.
Fact checking, yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Some people make a career out of it, but
it's true.
Yeah. Okay, well, how about you tell us what interested you about this issue in the first place? Because I know you've been talking to me about environmental econ for a while, and that you're interested in general, but I actually never got a good answer to why you're interested in it.
Okay.
Like
It's
hiking?
super random. I'll take you through my journey, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So it all started, no, but like, yeah, it would have been two years ago now. I was in the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee. And I was there with a couple of my friends, and it's beautiful. So we stopped at a bunch of overlooks just to, look out. And there was a plaque by the side of the road that basically said, like, this area was deforested by private logging companies, like completely destroyed the forest. And then after the Weeks Act of 1911, the US Department of the Interior was able to come in, and the Forest Service like redid the forest, and everything was great. I'm oversimplifying this plaque, but
Yeah.
that was the general gist, is like,
Yeah.
the logging companies messed it up, the government fixed it. And I was like, so I guess I would have been a year out of 103 at that Econ 103 at Mason,
Right.
which is introductory micro. And that's kind of the class where you kind of get like, property rights and ownership, incentivizes good stewardship of resources, blah, 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 right? Not blah, 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 like that's not true, but
Yeah.
you get this very, as in all introductory classes, right, this very simplified framework that doesn't really leave a lot of room for nuance. And so I read that plaque by the side of the road, and I'm like, I guess I would have been a sophomore in college. And I'm like, that's not what I was taught in my classes, right? And so I was just very interested in that question. And this started as a very historical research question where, like, I sat down with a PhD fellow, then a PhD fellow, he's since graduated, at Mason, and was like, look, here's my question. I want to look into this. And he was really helpful and offered me a lot of advice and kind of walked me through it. And it was a research project that I just pursued on my own because I wanted to. And then I was looking at like microfilm from the Census Bureau from the 1860s. And it was just not really a feasible project for me to do by myself with the resources I had.
Yeah.
And that became very clear. So now we're in my junior year. And in between there, I interned with the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, and I wrote a piece for them on climate change economics, and specifically central banks and finance, because my boss was like, what are you interested in? And I was like, I think it's environmental economics. So here we are. I'm going to write an article about it.
We'll put the link to that article in the description.
There you go. Yeah. That was a really, really great internship. And I enjoyed it a lot. But so I kind of got deeper into the field that way. And then I had to propose a research project for an honors class in my junior year. And I started out with this historical, like, what happened in the Cherokee National Forest, right? And I had a bunch of professors tell me, like, you aren't going to be able to do this. Like, you need tenure before you start this. And I was like, cool, I don't have that. I'm a junior in college. So with the help of my mentor, Dr. Dunick in the econ department, we kind of started looking at contemporary policies, because there's data on those that I don't have to like look at and strain my eyes and like die looking at, right? And also just this idea of, okay, I want to get econometric experience with analyzing data, and a difference in difference analysis is a really good way to do that policy analysis. So it was kind of like a backdoor entrance into like looking at Florida and this policy specifically, kind of stumbled upon it and looking for that. So that's how we got to this question. I think in general, what interests me about environmental economics is still this question of ownership and property rights and the nuance there. And I think just the difference in ownership, like, so you hear about the tragedy of the commons, right? All the time. Every single class, I swear, you learn the tragedy of the commons and the prisoner's dilemma, and you're like, I got it. I know these things already. You tell me this every time. And then maybe Eleanor Ostrom gets thrown in, like, oh, here's a sentence, like, she did some things. And it's like, no, like what she talked about in this idea that a community can put in place rules that govern natural resources that avoids both the tragedy of the commons, but also in private ownership, is so important it won her a Nobel Prize. So like, maybe we should talk about it a little bit. That's a whole other rant. But anyway, this idea of, okay, what are these different types of ownerships? What different incentives do they produce? And what are the economic impacts of that? How do they impact how people make decisions? Is really the like meta question, big picture part of what draws me to environmental economics. That, and it is relevant to our current context, and just to understanding the ways that people interact with their environment. So yeah, that's how I got here.
Okay, I want to go back to what you were saying about the Ostroms a little bit.
Yeah.
And for people that don't know, Eleanor Ostrom and her husband Vincent Ostrom, who we mentioned earlier, who helped write the Alaska Constitution, they did a lot of well, Eleanor more specifically did work on the tragedy of the commons problem, and that people oftentimes we look at a model and it says, oh well, you know, all these people are just going to take and take and take, and they're not going to leave anything for anyone else, and so we need some kind of outside force to come in and fix this, and that's what the model says, and that's what's going to happen. And then Eleanor Ostrom said, wait a minute, all around the world that's the case, but people aren't stealing from each other, or people figured it out. They already figured it out, but we didn't ask them. You know, maybe people are more complicated than they look like they are in the model. And but I'll push back on the fact that Ostrom might be relevant here because we're talking about the whole state of Florida.
Oh yeah, no, she's not like this. It isn't directly relevant to my question.
Okay,
like my question looks at. I mean, there aren't really that many instances. Maybe I'll have to eat my words after someone sends me something later, I don't know, but it does seem more like a dichotomy of like state and private ownership. There's not as much of a community aspect here. So yeah, no, that's more of how I got interested in this sphere of work rather than like this specific question. Yeah, and she's not relevant. Really
I think that's one of the problems generally is that we're at a level, or we're at a point where talking about community we're at the level where we're trying to solve problems that there have never been communities big enough to solve. You know,
right?
Like the people just talk like casually about the international community. What community?
Right.
No, there's the UN. What's that? You know, like, or it's that's one of the cool things about in Adam Smith is we can talk about like, oh, look how big the economy is. Look how many people are able to coordinate and interact and stuff. But really, like the core thing that we always have, the small group of people, the community where everyone knows each other by name and they know everybody's sister or whatever and what they had for breakfast, it's like still not as big. That kind of has like an upper limit.
Yeah,
How to get past. And then we were like, oh, social media, and now you can know what everybody has for breakfast. And it turns out that doesn't work very well.
Oh.
But
no, it does not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a lot of cool things here. Have you thought about going to Florida?
Yes, I have, and I would love to. I have friends that live in Florida, and I was like, I really wanted to make a visit out of it, but I wanted to do so many things this year, as did everyone, that Florida's not really the safest place to be right now, so.
I wanted to go to Boston.
You wanted to go to Boston?
Yeah.
Boston's really cool.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, I thought about it though. It's on my list of things to do. I know it was kind of sad. It was funny because I got a grant from Oscar, which is our Office of Student Scholarship, Creative Activities and Research at Mason for undergrads. And I worked. So that was like my summer job. So I worked on my research this summer, and I was like sitting on my little balcony in suburban Virginia, like looking out at my like 2 trees that separate my apartment complex from the neighborhood behind it, and I'm like, wow, the forests, like conservation, this is great. Yeah. So it was definitely like I would love, because that's, to go back to Eleanor Ostrom, one of the things that I really admire about her is the field work that she did, and the way that she said, okay, we've got these theories, let's look at how people are actually living and making decisions. I really admire that about her and about her methods, and I would love to be able to practice at least some of that, but just unfortunately right now with resource constraints and pandemic constraints, it's kind of hard to do that. So
yeah. Yeah, that was the most interesting what you just said, where because when I was looking at the thing, your paper initially, my first thought is, okay, who's rent seeking here? You know,
good libertarian, Marcus.
Yeah, but the ballot initiative is so bizarre to me, and that's got to be rare that happens like that. That just a large group of people in the same state are all behind something.
Right.
That's got to speak to what it was like. So I think it would be really cool. This would be maybe a second project, but to go down there and try to figure out why people voted for it. Or maybe they already have, maybe the legislators who are researching it. I don't know how you get something to be a ballot initiative, but the legislators who were researching, like, oh, I wonder who would vote for this, you know. like I mean, because most people went. I don't know if you've ever voted for a ballot initiative thing before.
I have. I
Yeah.
have.
Because
Yeah.
I think the only time I voted was in 2016. And I went in, and there was one for Fairfax, Virginia, and I had only been there 2 months. And it was like, oh, do you want to tax? You want to increase taxes? And I said no. So yeah, that was an easy one. But
Yeah.
but but yeah, I'm sure that most people just go into the voting booth and they're like, oh, what is this? What is this, Switzerland? We have to vote on everything? And then they're just like, it says like save the trees, and they go, yeah, check off save the trees, whatever.
Yeah.
And people probably aren't making the trade-offs in their head and figuring out, oh, how's this going to affect development and the forest industry and all this stuff. But it does express at least something that people would vote for that.
Yeah.
In a broad way. And there was no campaign against. There was no massive convincing campaign against it.
Right.
So yeah. Basically, I'm interested in the public choice side of this.
Well, right, yeah, and I mean, I kind of have a hard time figuring out what I want to focus on because there's so many different angles of this that are so interesting, and that is one of them. So I'll find after this like a link to like some news article or something about it and send it to you so you can see what the numbers were. But yeah, it is very interesting, and I mean, you can see right how you could make this a pretty convincing message, like. I don't know that many people, maybe this is just because I go to college and this is like not something like most college students are going to be like save the trees, probably more than most Americans, right? But like still treating the environment well, that as a phrase is a pretty bipartisan thing. Like there's not a lot of people out here who are like, I want to ruin the environment. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's not really a very popular statement to make. You can talk about jobs and industry and then you get into more contentious, right, kind of disagreements. But the general idea of protecting the environment to a certain degree is not a controversial one. So you could see, especially if your average Floridian is seeing a lot of development and seeing a lot of people move into their neighborhood in their area, and it's becoming and you know, they have this this awareness that this is a thing that's happening and they think that this will help, right? So I don't know, I'll find more information and send it to you, but
there's many different angles to attack like any issue from, or any research topic from. And I just watched a talk a week or so ago. I don't know, I think it was recorded, you could probably look it up, by Mike Munger. And it was hosted by IHS, but it was like how to do research. And it was just like Mike Munger just comes in and he'll just like command you. He's like, you got to get your work done. You've got to do the research. And he was like, every paper, just make it about one thing. He's like, I know you want to talk about all this other stuff. Just make it about one thing, please. Yeah. You know, it was very, I just started, I'm in my second month, almost third month of grad school. And this guy was just like, he has a phrase, Munger compliant. Are you Munger compliant? Which means you have, at any given time, you have 3 papers under revision at journals. And if you have that standard, you're Munger compliant. And if you're below Munger compliance, you're falling behind. You're falling behind.
Wow.
So
that's the standard.
And then he said the dissertation, that counts as like 2.
Okay.
So if you're working on your dissertation, you're like, you've got a little bit of a buffer zone. But after that, you're falling behind. But which is one of those good things. We're both Tolkien fans too, right? Yeah. There's a good and it sounds like he's putting a big stressor on you, you know? Which but I just read in the spring, this is what I did. One of the things I did at Cato, I read all of Tolkien's letters, right? And then
at Cato?
Well, while I was at home at Cato.
Okay.
Yeah, and then there's a one phrase that he gave that people that I get, it was incorporated into the story a little bit, is it's okay to have 2 standards for yourself, right? One, like that is just like you hold like an absolute perfect standard, and you got to meet the perfect standard, and you'll never let anything like let go of your vision of the perfect standard. And then people around you are like, well, it's okay if you like messed up that one time, and they're like, don't worry about it, because they're not you, so they're not so much worried about that, but they're also talking to you and saying like, oh, you're doing like above average, or you're doing fine, or something like that. So you don't have to hit the absolute gold standard, but you have to be there so that you actually try. So you have to put the stress on yourself so you actually try, but you also have to have people around you that don't hold that standard for you so that you don't die. So you have to, one standard to try, one standard so you don't die. And then that's the relationship between Frodo and Sam. So Frodo has this crazy high standard for himself, and then Sam is there to like help him out. So but Sam is just as much the hero.
See, I love that because that's the exact dynamic with like me, a lot of my friends, right? Is like, and I'm like that too. Like I'm like, I didn't do all the things, and they're like, can you calm down? Like you're fine. Yeah. And I had never thought about Frodo and Sam that way before, and I love that. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, and if you think Sam from the books is good, if you think Sam from the movies is good, try Sam from the 1980s cartoon movies, because he's crazy. He has a whole song. He sings in those movies. It's crazy.
That's awesome.
You know the one short period he's tempted to take the ring? Mm-hmm. He sings a song about it.
Wow.
It's pretty good. I'll put that in the description too.
Cool. Sounds good. It's going to be a link. What is the other thing you're linking? Like my article?
Yes. Yeah. We'll link everything. People love links. Cool. Do not underrate how much people love links.
Yes, that's fair. Yeah. It makes life easy. You go in and click a bunch of things and they pop up.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, well, any other last thoughts? Any other things going on?
No, I think we covered everything that I wanted to cover. Cool. I got in my like mini tragedy of the commons rant, which is good because I have a lot of feelings about it.
And so what's the next steps exactly?
So right now I'm figuring out conservation. Just figuring that out. And then for my thesis, I have to have a rough draft by the end of the semester, and then that goes through kind of a review process, both peer review and then like submitting it to other professors in the department and getting their feedback. And then ideally by the spring I should be able to present this.
Okay.
Is the plan.
Well, in person or online.
Right, yeah. It'll probably be online, I would imagine. Yeah. Which does have the advantage of making travel not a problem.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. So they had to cancel Appy, so I have a $600 voucher for a plane trip, which is I'll use that eventually.
Eventually you'll use that. Maybe not in the next year or something, right? But,
maybe not in this lifetime.
Not in this lifetime.
But great.
Yeah. Cool.
I have one more question for you.
Yes.
Are you going home for Thanksgiving?
Do you want to ride home for Thanksgiving? Yes, you can ride home for Thanksgiving.
I probably won't ride back because I'm going to bring my bike, but okay. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. I will try not to run into your neighbor's car again.
Oh, yeah, that happened once. Yeah. It was a tragedy of the commons. But yeah, okay. Very good. Thank you for coming on, Molly. And when you've found the answers, when you've gone to Florida and you've discovered the secrets of the Everglades, you're going to come back and tell us all about it.
Cool. Yeah, I'm down for part 2. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Very good. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.